Welcome, Carl.
Hi guys.
So yeah, me and Carl, this is the first time we're actually recording a conversation, but we had previous conversations where we launched deep into basically the connections between what I've called ontological design, and what Carl has called context engineering or Umwelt engineering. Whole point being that it is possible today using technology to manipulate the environment that people perceive with their senses and therefore achieve a great dimension of power over a lived experience. Is that right, Carl? Is that how you characterize it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was very pleased to see you talking about ontological design, and you turned me on to that term. And I always find it interesting when you come up with stuff and you come up with frameworks to help your own thinking, and then you discover other people doing exactly that in different ways. But yeah, I mean, my history is actually as an art historian, and then I did a second master's in computer science, and then I did architecture for 7 years. And I think all of those subjects had an element of, sort of various shifts in my perspective and my perception. And I found that doing a lot of 3D modeling affected the way I saw the world a lot. And I started to program my dreams, and I started to, I was reconstructing ancient buildings around the world, and I found that because I was working on these large structures, I could sort of see further down the road as a driver. I was actually improving my peripheral vision, even though I was still sort of immersed in a screen. I was actually having larger effects on my perception, and I suppose that was like the touch point for understanding that you can program your dreams, therefore you can program pretty much anything else. And I think that I'm very much interested in reality testing and actually creating consciousness, or creating unique forms of consciousness, and actually trying to experience things that have not been experienced before.
So you've made yourself kind of the guinea pig of your own reality constructions. I know that you're also interested in psychedelics. You've mentioned dreams. We've also spoke about storytelling. How does that all fit in? Like, for example, with the dream programming.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating one, isn't it? I think that I'm always looking to break out of the content bubble, and I'm completely swamped like everyone else is with information, and I'm always looking for ways to break out of the thinker and into the observer of the thinker, and to be much more aligned with context, with the ability to make context over content. And I think that's where we're headed. I think we're headed to a context economy, because everyone's swamped and everyone wants escapes. And I think if you meditate a lot, then you're entering context. If you're like lucid dreaming, then you're entering context. You're creating context for yourself. And I think it's a skill, and it's you can become a master at it. And I'm really interested in, say, for instance, people that practice. I know friends that do qigong and tai chi in a lucid dream state, and apparently according to them, it's 4 times more effective to do it in a dream than in reality, because you're having to apply the contextual factors. You're having to apply gravity. You're having to build the environment as well as do the action. So for me, that's in terms of neural networks, what that's doing to your brain is far more interesting than just everyday action. And I know people that go into dream states, and they'll experience a year in somebody else's body, and live day in, day out within that one dream, and then they wake up and it's just been one night. And then and what's going on? Are we building neural networks in that 1 year dream? I mean, I'm very interested in how we can ramp up the building of our own brains.
It feels like you're quite the mystic. Uh, Owen will have a couple questions on that in a little bit. I just wanted to point out that I was noticing that you're rocking back and forth, which
Yeah, well,
reminds me of
I'm actually in the rocking chair, so it looks a bit disturbing, but I'm actually the chair.
reason being, whenever I'm hearing, out of interest, rabbis talk about Kabbalah,
Yeah.
this is something that happens. And why? Because it's a meditation of mind, body, and soul. Maybe the dream state being invoked at the precise moment. Very priestly.
Well, I'm driven by the transformational experiences that I've been through, especially the ones that haven't depended on any sort of psychedelic or substance intervention, the things that are gifted to me without warning. And I think those are interventions, you know, that I would not propose to say from what source, but I use those as my fuel and as my way of structuring reality.
It feels to me like one of the things that humans have done and seem to have always done, as far as we know, is develop methodologies and technologies, and that word used in a very broad sense, for accessing that beyond that altered context, that altered state, whether that is plant medicines or meditations, yogas, music even. I think music is, as far as we understand, one of the very early ones. And taking a look through the website that you guys have now, I was getting the sense that this is the lineage very much within which we're working, right? I'm maybe you disagree with this, but I'm always tempted to say, like, what you're doing is not necessarily anything new. You're just using new tools to do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I presume you're talking about the Cyberdelics, Cyberdelics Society. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Yeah. And I was listening to you guys talking about ontological design in the previous podcast, and absolutely. I mean, this is it's cyber shamanism, if you like. But what I think we now have the potential to do, and I think that a lot of the, if you look at all the different ways we can alter consciousness, I mean, altered states of consciousness for me is just the stepping stone to altered traits of consciousness. And how do we create persistence? How do we go step beyond the gimmicks of like this constant chasing your tail of wanting a peak experience, and then pretending to integrate that, and then be like, I need the next one, like the typical junkie attitude. And I really am very interested in how do we move away, and how do we look at, I keep talking about double consciousness and this ability to, whether it's a lucid dream state where you're like you're in the conscious mind, but in the astral, for a better word, at the same time, whether you're like in a hypnopompic or a hypnagogic state, this is a double consciousness. Whether you're in a non-dual state, this is arguably the peak or the ultimate altered state of consciousness. But what I'm really interested in is what Eric Davis talks about when he says that actually the non-dual state and this sensation of all is one, it kind of is a contradiction, because it disregards the other, and it actually, the pluralism and the pluralistic way of thinking, that what is outside of existence, where I keep thinking about, we're in a form of existence where where the consciousness is creating matter, where the consciousness is fundamental, or whether consciousness is a product of the brain. I think, what is outside of consciousness? What is producing consciousness? And what is the other? What is beyond the white room of the 5-MeO-DMT state? When you experience that state, and you absolutely have this felt embodied experience of being everything and becoming light itself, it's kind of a rude thing to say, well, what's beyond that? But that's where I'm constantly pushing myself to constantly say, I'm trying to have like you say, this is nothing new, but I'm trying to find the new in that sense.
What comes to mind here was in one of our previous conversations, Carl, I'm connecting to something they said now. We were talking about chasing peak experiences, but then going back to work on Monday morning, and how this all fits within the rat race of capitalists, modernists, time, and all of those constraints. And we were connecting that to these altered states where you talk about another set of rules. Some authors call it eternal time, going outside of the time of progress and evolution and tapping into a time that is ruled by a whole other set of assumptions, another set of rules. And it feels to me like that's a very priestly function. It's a function that, as time moves on, it gets institutionalized in churches and practices, etc. To be the guardian of the doorway to that eternal time requires a set of keys, which naturally we try to reverse engineer, we try to explore in this age of techno-shamanism, technomancy. But I wanted to ask you a little bit, where does it get dangerous? As in, I'm going to get weird now, but Robert Anselm Wilson, which I'm sure you probably knew, he said that power is a war between rival gangs of sorcerers. So what's your take on something like that? What's your take on beyond access, the monopoly, and the associated things?
Yeah, I mean, the dangers are multiplying with the multiplicity. You know, I think that the big danger of context engineering is that we lose common ground. You know, I remember a time when we had 3-4 channels on the television, and you know, people would have a common space, a common sort of narrative, and now everyone's in these little bubbles. And I think if you're able to then change the way you perceive reality as the new content, then you know your common ground is gone, and everyone's going to experience, you know, whether you're a racist and you're using mixed reality to turn everyone a certain color, a certain shade, or if you don't like men and you choose to delete them from your field of view, everyone will live in a different world. And I think that reality itself is already scary enough for a lot of people. So the thought of being able to change reality at a core perceptual level is going to be difficult to swallow for a lot of people. And yeah, I think, you know, if we look at Neuralink from Musk, which he claims is a year away in some sort of form, whereas I think it's, you know, certainly 15 years away in real form. You know, I think the Cyberdelics stuff is actually interesting because we want to democratize the psychedelic experience. We're not trying to replicate psychedelics. We're trying to enable people to create reliable altered states with technology, with the ability to, you know, explore consciousness without needing to lose control, which is obviously one of the defining factors of a psychedelic. But the point is that you take the headset off. You know, if it's implanted in the brain, then you have no chance of removing that. And who owns the hardware, who owns the software? But yeah, other examples, I suppose, you know, like the DMT extended experiment from Imperial, where we can potentially, you know, extend the peak of the DMT state permanently, and use the third dimension just as a base layer to launch into hyperspace. You know, leave the third dimension behind. I think, you know, for whatever reason, we're here to have a human experience, and you know, I'm all for. And my main thing is, you know, it's your birthright to explore your consciousness and to transform your consciousness and to create new types of consciousness, but within the realms of this human condition. And you know, if we talk about transhumanism versus hyperhumanism, in terms of the branch of posthumanism that is hyperhumanism, I think that what we have to really do is explore the untapped potential, the innate analog, if you like, potential that we have, and use technology as a way of accessing that. So just use technology as a form of catalyst to access your own engines.
For listeners, could you clarify that distinction between posthuman and hyperhuman?
Well, yeah, I mean, hyperhumanism is a form of hyperhumanism is a form of posthumanism. Transhumanism is, utter dependency on technology, like Neuralink. I've had a long chat with old Ray Kurzweil about this, and wrote a talk specifically to try and counter the transhumanist argument. And it's all about, obviously, life extension. It's concerned with human being the sort of the top of the food chain, and just exacerbating all the problems that we're already seeing. And hyperhumanism is much more concerned with the non-human, learning from the non-human, and learning from something like the mycelium, the mushroom, which has survived five mass extinctions whilst we're busy causing the sixth. So how can we learn from something that's clearly more intelligent than us, that has a larger consciousness than we do, even now, something that actually, when is in abundance, shares by default. I'm very, the hyperhumanism idea is that there's many types of self, and there's many ways of adopting intelligence that is not fundamentally through technology. It's about the innate, the analog. It's basically taking the best affordances of the analog, the best affordances of the digital, and then combining them to create this new state where we, like I said before, that we understand our resources, with limitations on this planet, and we respect that, and we act in a more humble way, where we're not wiping out 60% of every other species in 45 years.
So here's something that I have voiced to you in a way, and I'm going to try to be explicit with it now, because I think it's precisely at the crux of it. There are, in my view, hidden assumptions that we carry with us, and when we dive deeper into cyberspace, we carry them with us, and we are like fish unaware of the water in which they swim. So are we with relation to those assumptions. For example, the idea that democratization is good is 100 years old. But the idea that we are perhaps not the dominant entities within this planet is thousands of years old. And so with time and with the evolution of technology, so do these ways of thinking evolve, right? So the age of the printing press had certain theotechnologies or entheogenic properties. The age of digital has obviously their own specific ones, which is precisely what you're exploring. Nick Land, the genius Nick Land, he talks about something very similar to what you spoke about with the mycelium. Nick Land says that the egregores, which is a term that I'm sure you're aware of, egregores, thought forms, these macrobes, right? These collective bundles of human thought that grow larger than us and eventually have precedence over us and agency over us. They act like bacteria. They have bacteriological analog properties. And I find that very interesting, that even now at this time in history, when we're trying to build bridges to higher dimensions in consciousness, if we want to put it like that, that we do it in a way we're riding a bicycle to the heavens, but our bicycle has two wheels and it has a way to sort of pedal and all that. And those hidden assumptions in our speech, and this is a very Foucauldian point, include things like destroying the planet is bad and democracy is good. I'm being the devil's advocate here, but I'm saying that those are assumptions that we operate with. And there's many others. There's, you know, in the New Age community, there's a lot of theocratic impulses, you know, you name it, across the political spectrum. What do you feel about that? What are your thoughts on the hidden assumptions of our thoughts and them being sort of our bicycles that we carry towards these other dimensions?
Yeah, I think it's like, you know, it's, I mean, I'm very interested in, you know, I run this other thing called the London Experiment Psychonautics Club, and we had one guy talking about how to create your own tulpas, you know, and you know, we know tulpas are the units of the egregores, and I think I mentioned this to you before. And one of my colleagues was like, "Well, you can't publish that talk. I mean, it's far too dangerous to be."
Could I clarify what you mean by the talk pods and the egregores?
So tulpa is a thought form.
Mm.
A thought form is something like, you know, you could say it's an imaginary friend, but it's something that you give your energy to. It's something that you give your belief to, and you start to, you know, through your feeding it your belief, you give it existence, and when it reaches a certain level, it has its independence, and it will, you know, it's a thought form. It's something that has solidity in that sense. An egregore is like a religion, when there's a lot of people believing in the same thing, and a lot of people giving that energy, and then it manifests. But yeah, Daniel, you have to give me more on what you're asking, because I'm still.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to try to be as succinct as possible. So we think with the tulpas that our current egregores give to us. Agriculture possibilitated the emergence of a specific set of egregores, right? The Neolithic Revolution, we became sedentary. And so we started to have different gods than before, different egregores.
Mm-hmm.
Gods of war, gods of the crops, gods of other things, of cities, of settled places. And we carried those tulpas with us.
Mm-hmm.
Then monotheism came. There's a loose analogy that I like to make when Freud writes Moses and monotheism. He's alluding to the connection between the emergence of the ego and of God, the Abrahamic monotheistic God, which is very interesting, but I don't know if it's a point I wish to pursue. But this just a signal that different egregores produce different tulpas. And the tulpas of our time are interesting, but also in the process of being recycled. So my question to you is a little bit like, as a person who's very much at the edge of exploring with your own tulpas, the outer edges. Tulpas are like your bicycles. They're theotechnologies. They're what we ride into the beyond. They're the Merkaba, if you want to get new agey.
Yeah.
And so my question is about that. It's about tulpa design. It's about reality design. Also of our own assumptions. Also of how we choose to think about these things. Because right now we use the discourses of academia, of the age of the internet. You mentioned Eric Davis and virtual reality and all these things. Whereas 300 years ago, we might be in a completely different setting using a different vocabulary to do the same things. This is why what we're doing is not necessarily new. It's like putting the wine into new bottles, a new wine into new bottles. So, to quote a very important man. So, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's getting there. I think that if I think about Gebser and his you know, moving from the perspectival to the aperspectival, you know, this mutations of consciousness, and then one houses the next within it. I'm very much, you know, like I mentioned before, I'm very driven by my my transformational experiences, and the fact that, you know, I have, you know, I've had a life review at 40 when when my life stopped going forwards and started, started going in reverse, and I experienced my entire life in reverse, the entire 40 years in reverse. And I was able to, be in my current state of consciousness, but also in my state of consciousness going backwards. And so in a double consciousness, very, very, very sort of very felt sense double consciousness. But then I realized rapidly I was able to go into anything else in the scene. And the first thing I chose was a desk. I went into wood. I went into this wooden structure and became wood. So I was in 3 levels of consciousness. And, and then I could go into other people and become them. And so, I was able to, I went back 2 years in time, and I was with a girl, and she got pregnant. She told me, I'm pregnant, the abortion's on Tuesday, and puts the phone down. So I go, she was living in Berlin, I was in London. And, I went over to Berlin, and because I was in this life review, I was able to go into her body and experience what it was like to be pregnant. And I was also then, I was thinking, well, I consciously thought, well, let's go into the womb and experience what it's like to be aborted. And so, I was in 4, I was in a quadruple, this parallel state of consciousness. So, this has made me question whether I, if we talking about thought forms and those being the bicycles of which I'm riding, then I'm very confused at the boundaries of these thought forms. And I know that a life review is a thought form in itself, that these things have happened to many, many people. And arguably my understanding of death is one now that, you experience in the death state whatever you've done to somebody as them and you at the same time. I had free will, and I was able to go into anyone else. I had to have lived it in order to access it. But, this is why I'm bringing up Gebster and the aperspectival, because this was my ultimate aperspectival experience, where I was literally able to have field of view. And now I realize in my life, I'm actually driving the point of view in order to access the field of view in the death state. And I really do live my life like that now. I'm very careful about who I spend my time with, because and I also I'm also very conscious that whatever I do, it'll be known. It's all known. There is no privacy. This is just a fantasy. And I had free will. I was able to choose to go into certain people and experience what I had done to them as them. But I think in the death state, you don't have a choice, and you do go. It's the ultimate learning machine.
Yeah.
And you get the most out of it by going through it as many times as you need to in order to learn as much as you can. So yeah, I'm not sure that's answering your question, but I hope it's getting somewhere.
No, it hits it on the nail on the head. Like you're describing it, the journey of a pure psychonaut, and I know that's not your perspective, but it's like rereading the doors of perception listening to you. It's if I'm going to take it to McLuhan's terms and a little bit what Owen usually very much talks about, your perception was not discrete, it was gestalt. It was a rhizome, not a tree. It was not a thing, it was something else. So what I want to ask to you, given your experience and this sort of unique way to navigate the quality of your own perception, what are your favorite, and also being a guy who works with tech and with psychedelics, what are your favorite magical tools or sigils? What are your favorite anchors, things like medallions, things that you use that are your own, familiar to you, to put around your schema, or to orient yourself when you're perhaps in one of those states?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I've always been, sigils I've always been fascinated by, but always, I've always, a bit like the internet, I'm always trying to avoid using it if I can use my own faculties to get there. And the same with sigils. I've been given sigils to charge. For instance, my girlfriend was four or five interviews into being a BBC presenter and really wanted the job, so she decided to make a sigil, and for some reason she went away for the weekend. She gave it to me to charge it, and I charged it a couple of times, and unfortunately for her, she didn't get the job. But I ended up doing nothing but presenting work and film work after that. So obviously the sigil did its work, and I know that they're incredibly powerful things, and I think there's always a price to pay for any sort of magic with a K. I think that the universe finds a way to make you pay for whatever shortcuts you make. And
Of course.
I'm always looking for the shortcuts, and I'm always looking to see which ones are safe to take. And I guess I'm obsessed with sound. I've got like 10,000 chords, and I'm obsessed with the different brain entrainment and the magic of that, and putting yourself into specific states with specific frequencies, and even like singing bowls. I've got a couple of Tibetan singing bowls, and one of my friends who gave them to me, he was like, I'm able to access this liminal space just through interacting with these things. I guess the disassociatives for me are the big sort of tools for dissolving the self and accessing everything else. So I think my tool set is very much a mixture of technology with like things like Shakti mats. I don't know if you've ever stood on a Shakti mat for any length of time.
No.
Shakti mat is a modern day bed of nails.
Oh yeah, I've heard of those.
Yeah, so highly recommend those things. If you combine, say, and this is why, to answer your question, I'm interested in stacking stuff. Like Jamie Will is, looking at a lot. If we start with some breath work, start with a meditation to put you into the context. You stand on the Shakti mat for like an hour, and you're able to access this holographic world that's navigable with your breath. And I think that these realities look very much like virtual reality. They look extremely digital. These realms are made of light, and I'm really obsessed with we mentioned 5-MeO-DMT, which is like you becoming the light source. And when you look at ayahuasca or NN-DMT, you see this holographic world out in front of you, and it's all light coming out of it. It's made of light. And in the third dimension, we're in a space which is having light shone upon it. So what is going on with these different experiences of light in these different realms? And I think it's a mistake to say that these are different dimensions. They're just different ways of perceiving the same space. It's all in the same space.
There's a couple of really interesting things that come to mind for me there. The first kind of comes from the work of Gregory Bateson, who was a proto-systems thinker and cybernetics researcher. And he is this short essay where he lays out a really kind of interesting and I find quite convincing argument from a purely kind of rational materialist standpoint about the existence of a kind of global mind. And I'm not saying we need to go down the pure materialistic route, but it's interesting to explore what he does, where he's talking about the act of someone with an axe chopping down a tree. What happens? You swing the axe at the tree, takes a wedge out of the tree. You then draw the axe back, observe that wedge that's been taken out of it, and adjust your swing concurrently for the next. So the next chunk that gets taken out, it's not just a random chunk, but it's a chunk that relates to that first chunk that was taken out. And if you were to think about the system that is processing this action and information transfer, it goes from the eye down through the nervous system to the hands to the end of the axe to the tree, and there's a loop that's going on there. The mental system is not just the flesh and body nervous system, it is that within which it is interacting. You take that as a very kind of local microcosmic example, but then you scale up and you say that everywhere there are mentally perceiving bodies and things that are being perceived by them, there is this constant interplay between all of these pieces, which then gets me thinking about, I think it's a kind of philosophical movement that I'm just beginning to touch on and study, which goes by the name of agential realism. I think Karen Barrett is one of the thinkers there, which she was a quantum physicist by training, I believe. And they are, again, trying to go transmaterialism or post-materialism, as well as looking at getting beyond the simplistic subject-object divide and saying what we get from quantum physics is that actually everything is interacting with everything else all the time. And that is the way that we should be approaching the world around us as well, not in terms of we are perceiving subjects and those are objects and these are distinct things, but these are fields of intensity of relating phenomenon, to get into kind of Whiteheadian language. And this, as I said, that is what's coming up for me as you're talking about the use of sigils, the exploration of context, because I think once we open that door and begin to see ourselves not as a nervous system contained by skin, bone and flesh, but as some kind of interface with that which is beyond us. But even the language of beyond us comes from that split. It's not beyond us. It is all one thing with many parts.
The division is of the bicycle.
You and your bicycles, I like it. Did you want to talk a little bit more about bicycles, Daniel, while we're at the subject?
I mean, Owen, if you allow me to riff on what you just said.
Absolutely.
Because it was just fascinating. Do you know what that reminds me of? Naturally, you were talking about this continuity, right? Of the posthuman, between subject and object, between context, perception, and reality. That's why sigils work, because there's no difference between mind and matter. They're continuous. And one of the ways that we can sort of zoom in the lens and actually go and explain why that continuity exists and why magic is real is to go into the guys that I like, Deleuze, Delanda. Delanda talks about the morphogenetic potential of materials. The classic example being with steel. Steelworking evolved, and all of a sudden someone put steel and gunpowder together and invented a barrel, and all of a sudden you have ballistics, and you have a rifle. And then when you have a rifle, you also are able to, a few years later, to make a cannon. When you make a cannon, you have to build smaller fortresses to defend against the cannon, because all of a sudden war has changed. So what I've just described to you is kind of a genealogy of a machine based on the morphogenetic potential of the materials that compose that sort of lineage, right? Talking about steel and gunpowder and etc. So if you remove the constraint of time, the cannon already kind of existed when the steel was in the mountain and in the gunpowder. So there's the potential in the planet, which eventually, with the work of humans and worms and birds and animals, brings out that potential and makes it into reality, perhaps with lineages of technology that, you know, end up in weaponry and all that stuff, right? Having said that, like the question that I'd like to ask you, Carl, is there any notable voice in your inner pantheon that you feel like highlighting right now?
Good question. I mean, I'm with you, you know, on all of the sort of Nietzschean stuff and Wittgenstein as well, because I think, you know, the language games, the fact that language created a layer, much like we're now doing with mixed reality, is, you know, it goes back to Gebser as well, with this move from the unperspectival to the perspectival to the aperspectival. And, you know, if we look at cubism, for instance, cubism, you know, is aperspectival because you contain the context in the object. You know, the walk around the object is contained within the object, so time is contained there. And it's like, you know, and as we're talking, you know, the operating system becomes so broad. It's like everything it can relate to everything else. And I'm very much interested in evolving the ways we can experience reality. And you know, if I think about some of my, you know, more recent experiences with you know, Umwelt hacking, I had this incredible experience of becoming. I was a dream, and I was detangling a ginormous bat from an alligator that was attached to this bat. And as I removed the alligator, I managed to become the bat, and I was literally experiencing from this entirely new sensorial system. So I guess for me, it's, you know, how do we, you know, because I always think of language as this great distancer, and I'm, you know, if we talk about the primitive pre-perspectival stuff, you know, it's not just going forward. It's not an evolution. It's all of it. It's being able to jump out of these boxes. And
let me press on that, because that's beautiful what you're talking about. Some shamans of some tribes in the Amazon, and then something similar is recounted by some people from the Zuni tribes, talk about a form of animism where, for example, I don't know if this is real or if it's legend, but the way that they discovered the correct aggregation or combination of herbs to make ayahuasca. Where did they hear it? How did they find it? Because it's really hard to find and combine these specific herbs from all the herbs available in the forest. The answer is the plants told us. Some sort of hunters from communities that have a more animistic bent to them say that, yeah, I become the jaguar, I become the deer that I am hunting. The Zuni elder talks to the cactus, and you do that. That's why this is in the Western tradition of the occult. That's kind of like lycanthropy. Let's say it's becoming a werewolf. It's becoming this and that. So, like, the question that I want to ask you is, like, what's your night? Where are you hunting stuff out there? Like, where are you being led to? Where are the gods taking you, if you will? You know, the Egyptians said that it was Thoth that gave them agriculture. So where are the gods giving to you now?
I think it's I think where I'm being led is to a place beyond any sort of reliable, you know, it's difficult. I think that every new day brings new opportunities to understand what I have the potential to do, and what I can then therefore share. You know, and all I can do is create frameworks around the kinds of experiences that I'm having, in order to see if other people are sharing these things and whether they can be shared. And I you know, it's just a privilege to be alive, and to have the opportunity to explore my consciousness when I know it's a privileged position. a lot of the time, and to have created a reality for myself where this is my main operating principle and my main source of everything. And I don't know how it's happened really. It's a mystery to me that I'm able to do this on a daily basis. But I guess what I'm very much looking forward to is really understanding, whether you can actually look at the signature of the brain and say, this is, because I've got a friend that's working on this at the moment, who's looking at, the out of body experience signature, the near death experience signature of the brain, and to see whether we can reverse engineer that and say, a lot of people are able to induce out of body experiences, and he, and this guy's saying, well, I'll be measuring your brain whilst you're doing it, and then he will say, well, actually, you might think you're having an out of body experience, but you're not. You're just you're having, you're having something happen to you, but it's not actually, the real thing. So, whether it's a question of having authentic experiences that then you can say this is the standard. I think that, he's looking at, for instance, what happens to people on DMT, and he's, we can now, I've been in the experiments at Imperial where they're giving, they're scanning my brain whilst I'm being injected with NN-DMT, and sure enough, the brain signature is one of dreams. You look like you're in a dream state.
Mm.
So whether that's the right route, though, I'm not sure. I think that it's great that Imperial are doing those sorts of experiments. It's great that these things are being accepted. But it's like we talked, Daniel, about the mystery schools of ancient Greece, that these things were only ever meant for the few, and the democratization of this stuff is not necessarily what we want to be doing. So, when I speak to people, one of my friends, Kichi Matsuda, who did a lot of the sort of early sketches of what augmented reality may mean for society, he's warning me off this stuff. And I think that, those initiates or those inner mysteries were sentenced to death if they shared this knowledge. So, but for me, my first out of body experience at 27 resulted in a disembodied voice telling me to tell everyone about that experience, and to tell everyone that there is no death, and that you only perceive that you're Carl. You're only having the experience of being Carl for 1,000 months, but that's not what you actually are, or not the limit of what you are. So because I was given permission then to tell everybody, because normally these transformational experiences, you're told not to tell anyone. You're told to keep them to yourself, because otherwise you're giving away something. But I think, I feel as if I'm constantly reminded that I'm on the right path, even if that does mean being sacrificed at the end of it.
Very cool.
Carl, something I would like to open up and explore a little bit. I've found in my own life, working and exploring at this space, the intersection of new philosophy and technology, and indeed with altered states of consciousness. I wouldn't describe myself as a seasoned psychonaut or psychedelics user, but I have had a solid few trips. One of the things that's become apparent to me is there's a real felt sense in my world of a desire to ground myself in something old and systematic and quite thorough, which has taken me to trying to basically be a student of classical hatha yoga and indeed tantra as well. Trying to get as far away as I can from anything that feels too new agey in California, Kundalini, sexy pictures on Instagram. because, well, my at least hope is that through connecting to something old and time tested and with lineage, it will then provide some kind of almost nest within which to be able to explore forwards without running the risk of blasting off too far or getting lost within personal storylines, narcissistic projections about how I've touched the divine and thus I'm now a messenger come to speak to all others, which feels kind of like one of the things you were touching on just there about the fact that people can get persecuted. I wonder if you have any thoughts or personal practices yourself that about kind of grounding and not blasting off too far.
Yeah, I guess you know, I do find that, yeah, the usual things really, just connecting to nature, to making sure I do some meditation, to, I mean, recently during lockdown, you know, incredibly sobering state, facing your mortality. And I think that, you know, for me, writing a diary is incredibly grounding, because I'm constantly doing the aperspectival thing. I'm using the diary, which I've written for 30 years, to jump out of point of view and to go into field of view and to see my progress and to see where I'm going, and to look at the pattern recognition of, yeah, actually I can see over the course of this year I've done this, and this, and actually, you know, I'm on, like I said before, on the path. But it's difficult to you know, it's difficult to know where you're going, and I you know, I think that you just need to maintain the health of your body, and I do that a lot with breath work recently. I mean, doing, you know, I'm amazed by 3 rounds of Wim Hof breathing. You know, it's not obviously Wim's borrowed it, but I just think that's super grounding. Doing your 30 breaths times 3, within like 5 minutes, you're reaching this context, you're reaching that ability to jump out of the thinker and to turn down the volume of this constant brain chatter. You're where you're constantly criticizing yourself, and Huxley's right. You know, you need to take regular holidays from the self, and by any means necessary, I think is the key there. I think that whatever gets you away from this brain chatter, and I think that we need reliable methods to do that. And I think, you know, we're struggling with attention. We need to be able to get there quite rapidly. I mean, you mentioned Kundalini as a way not to go, but I do a bit of Kundalini. And
Sorry, I wasn't saying not the way to go, but I'm just saying the way that in some of the yoga scene, I feel like there's a lot of it's like just kind of self-empowerment through things that are a very powerful feeling. But my worry is that for some users, it's kind of just a high.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that, I mean, on Sunday I did 3 different breath classes, and I was thinking, hang on a minute, like, is there too much breathing? Is there too much of this? Because you can reach 5-MeO like levels of awareness and consciousness through the breath, and I think that is so mind blowing and so empowering at the same time. If you do it in a grounded way, and like you say, if you do it in moderation, I think the amazing thing about almost everything is that there's a tolerance to it. There's a bit that built-in mechanism. You do something too often, and it won't work anymore.
Well, yeah, it's fascinating. Like within the yoga tradition which I work, and pranayama is the name for breath work within yoga. There's a real emphasis that you should only do the breath work after you've done a physical practice and a relaxation, so your mind is already in a calm state. And B, you should do it with the guidance and I don't know if permission's the word, but with a teacher kind of around as well, precisely because it can be so powerful. I had a friend recently, I know, did a load of breath work and then changed her Facebook name to a Sanskrit word for peace or something. And then she sent me a message and I was like, who the fuck are you? And she was like, yeah, I did loads of breath work and thought I was God and decided that I was going to make that my Facebook identity. And I was like, and she's like, yeah, I got to wait 60 days to change it. So this shit does work, right? But that also just, it shows you that whole thing about coming down from it and wanting to be like, and explode.
Yeah, go ahead. Were you going to say something, Tanya?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. I mean, and this comes back to kind of what Daniel and myself is very interested in. It's like, when you're building a virtual reality experience, you've got to be aware that you need to have a certain understanding of physiology, of psychology, of perception, cognitive sciences, because you are building the context as well as the content. The brain thinks it's happening, and you have a tremendously large responsibility over any artist beforehand, because you are replacing imagination with computer animation a lot of the time. And I think that is super dangerous. And it's one of the powers of virtual reality, but one of the big double-edged swords of it. And I think that, just to give you one example, one of my colleagues had put her friend through a near-death experience in a VR simulation of a near-death experience. And this person had done a lot of work on themselves, like a lot of grounded work over a long period of time. And basically said that within that 20 minutes in that VR experience undid all of that work, and was super damaged by it, and was not prepared, and the space was not held like it would be in a physical analog form, and that's because they were exploring the death shadow. And before the death shadow comes the child shadow, and then the ancestral shadow work, and then the sexual shadow work, and then finally, once you've done all that, you explore the death shadow work. And again, it was that shortcut directly to death, and the previous work hadn't necessarily been done, or the person designing the VR experience hadn't done that previous work. And I think that's a warning. It's a huge responsibility, and I think that that comes back to the whole question of these inner mysteries, and the fact that in these inner mystery schools, you went through a death and a rebirth experience, and there's a lot of power in dying, and there's an art to dying well, and a lot of respect has to be given.
That's so cool. Like you said, dying well. All I could think about was the noble warrior mythologies that pepper the world, and dying a good death, valiant, noble death, going to Valhalla, which is obviously an archetype that only exists for blockbusters nowadays because of commodification. Now, you said something very interesting when you were talking about Wim Hof breathwork, and those breathing techniques. I remember reading them on this magazine by Aleister Crowley, and he called it fanning the embers. I think I told you this. Something like doing that quick breathing, because it just gets you high effectively, and then being high, you plasticize perception and you do things with it. Now, what's cool about Crowley, right, is that in the context of few magical orders and his own exploration with psychedelics and with all that stuff, he was also in a way a virtual reality designer or a context engineer, and also like a guy who ties himself on the back of rockets to go up, right? There was a story where he permanently damaged a guy by feeding him mescaline and fucking him in the ass in the desert seriously. And I read this and I was like, this is crazy. And precisely to the point that these things, they require it's structure is good. Rockets are nice, but structure is good, and it comes down to, you know, the shaman goes out of the village and finds something, but then brings it back and brings it down to Middle Earth, right?
Yeah.
To the middle dimension. And I feel like many of the techniques of perceptual manipulation that, you know, Crowley did with magic and psychedelics and all that were also done and then adopted by other magicians. Rock and roll, you know, in broadcast society was nothing but a means of purveying transcendental experiences. Rock and roll concert. Think of obviously rock and roll, the whole history. And I think that seeps down into digital and into VR, right? So all of these things, from Crowley to rock and roll to digital, they're all means to translate for like digesting the hypostasis of the transcendental seeping down, right?
Mm.
And like when it falls down, the bricks into which it materializes, that's the exciting part for me personally. And obviously for all of us, like when I say bricks, those bricks can be practices, they can be rituals, they can be institutions, they can be combinations of technology, they can be music. More than the bricks is also the ability to lay them together and to build things.
Yeah, 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 and absolutely, I think that it's a huge citizen science project. You know, I think the magic is in the combinations. You know, we've got all these siloed disciplines that absolutely will grow exponentially if we combine them. And you know, I think that if we look at, for instance, moist media from Roy Ascott, which is this combining the dryware with the wetware. So all the people experimenting with VR whilst high, whilst taking different substances. You know, there's a group on Reddit called Rift into the Mind, which is basically, you know, an Oculus Rift community that are taking different drugs with different VR experiences, and they're reporting back what they're finding. And obviously they're finding that disassociatives are an incredibly powerful tool in this moist media combination to combine with VR, because you, number one, you forget that you've taken a drug, and number two, you forget you've put a VR headset on. So these things are new sciences waiting to be opened and already are being explored, because now we have the capacity to do that. And I think, yeah, the stacking. You know, one of my new projects is Holotechnica, where we from the Greek holo to combine into the whole, and technica. So the techniques, combining the techniques together to create these effects, these augmentations of consciousness. We know we can hack consciousness, but why would we want to hack consciousness? What's the point? And ultimately, what is beneficial, and whether it's beneficial to society, beneficial to the individual, and what does it mean to benefit? This is, you know, it's
Precisely. Do you want to know what keeps me up at night?
Yeah.
The fact that the word hollow means whole, but you could also use total. So holistic and totalitarian, basically the same word. And so whenever we follow this almost eschatological trend towards the front, away from Eden, feels like there's, you know, the old tales do warn us about a reign of the Antichrist, if you will. And honestly, I think that's something that's quite scary about modernity and its progress, especially at this precise edge where you can, you know, these moist media explorers, these VR designers from Crowley to ourselves, we're touching the point where culture and cult are technologies. And you plug an AI onto that does A/B testing at scale, that selects people for appropriateness, and all of a sudden you have a very powerful force that might fucking split off from humans and indeed create a holistic world.
Guys, I'll jump in. I'm just mindful we've already gone 10 minutes over when we said we'd stop, Carl.
we're just getting started, aren't we, Vincent?
I know. No, I mean, it's up to you if you want to keep talking or you want to wrap it.
Well, in the sense that my girlfriend's going to murder me if I don't spend some time with her this evening. But I would love to. Yeah, I could talk. I could. Yeah, I do feel like we just got started. So maybe we can have another one of these sometime soon.
Absolutely.
Let's riff again on this soon, man.
That'd be great.
Fuck yeah.
It's been a pleasure, boys.
It's been a pleasure having you.
Pleasure's been ours. Thank you so much, Carl.
Take it easy, guys.
Have a good
Take
one.
care of yourself.
Bye bye.